Is there anyone in the room who doesn't know anything about BFO? Oh, that's very good. Okay. So I'm going to assume that you all know a lot. The current official version of BFO is BFO 2.0, which is specified in English in the specification and user guide, and it's specified in OWL in those two OWL files, namely BFO classes only OWL and relation ontology, RO OWL. Now, this is, for a number of reasons, a clumsy position to be in, because people can choose different versions of RO.OWL. They can choose a very small one or they can choose a larger one. And our original goal in creating BFO 2.0 was to create a single artifact which would have all the class terms that you need to use BFO successfully and all the relation terms that you need in order to use BFO successfully. But we couldn't do that. Not because we were incapable or because there's something wrong with BFO, but because OWL, it turns out, would not work in the way that we require. Now, finally, we have reached a situation where we have a working version which meets at least many of the needs of people who are using BFO. Now, there is some quite significant developments since BFO 2.0 was released. And the first development is that BFO is on the verge of becoming an ISO standard. So this will be the first ontology which, as an ontology, is deemed to be an ISO standard. That was a lot of work. Another piece of news is that BFO is now used quite extensively in the field of industry, industrial engineering, manufacturing, and I'll give some examples of the work which is going on that front, some of which is relevant to some of the interests of people in the OVO Foundry community. So this is the standard. You'll see that the motto of ISO is "when the world agrees," which I still find very strange. But in any case, it takes a lot of time to get the world to agree to a new standard. So we started in 2017. And in order to become approved as an ISO standard, you have to have a committee which has multiple countries represented on the committee. And then the committee goes through successive versions of the standard, votes on the standard, typically with recommendations or comments. Those comments then have to be addressed in the next version. And then the committee votes on the next version. Now, we are at the point of reaching the final vote. So the standard consists actually of three parts. The first part, part one, the DIS stands for Draft International Standard, which is the last phase before International Standard. Part one is called Top-Level Ontologies Requirements. And so it consists of a set of requirements for being a top-level ontology. This is a standard, not just of ISO, but of the International Electrotechnical Commission, which I hope will be reassuring to all of you. So the same people that give you standardized plugs and sockets are also giving you BFO. And so this is the standardized plugs and sockets. And we want everything to connect, do we not? That's why we built the OVO Foundry. So there is a joint technical committee of ISO and IEC devoted to information technology. There's a complicated set of working groups. We were under the metadata standards working group, which is working group 2, which is a working group of the subcommittee for data interchange, which is a subcommittee of the joint technical committee. And so an ontology is a collection of terms, relational expressions, and definitions, together with one or more formal theories designed to capture the intended interpretation of those definitions. And then we define domain, and we define domain ontology. Basically, a domain ontology is an ontology which represents a restricted domain, such as biology or cell biology or plant cell biology and so on. Terms in an ontology represent categories. And we define a category as a general class or type that is shared across many different domains. This is a word that comes from Aristotle. For Aristotle, the categories were the highest level universals. And the top-level ontology is an ontology that is created to represent just the categories. That is to say, that they are the universals or classes or types which are shared across a maximally broad range of domains. Now, in ISO context, you always have to provide not merely a set of requirements, but also a set of procedures that will enable people to check that those requirements have been satisfied. And so we had a question, how do we check that a proposed top-level ontology, such as BFO, is such that its categories are shared across a maximally broad range of domains? Well, what we did was we created a list of kinds of data that people might have, and we attempted to show, or we required that people with an ontology show that their ontology can cover annotations for all of those kinds of data. Now, another requirement is that you have one or more formalizations, and we require 2 formalizations, one in OWL and one in what is called common logic. Now, how many people in this room know what common logic is? Very few people. How many people know what first order logic is? So far more. First order logic is a rich language, logical language, very, very stable. It's the logical language that everyone uses when, for instance, they formalize scientific theories. And OWL is a small subset of first order logic. Common logic is basically a slightly enriched version of first order logic, which has been formulated in a way which is convenient not just for human beings, but also for computers. Common logic is an ISO standard, and we were required to use common logic as one of our axiomatizations because we're required to reuse other ISO standards wherever possible. To be a top-level ontology, an ontology has to cover all of the main categories of data or of entities. It has to have 2 formalizations, and it has to have a textual artifact, which means natural language definitions of all the terms and all the relational expressions. These are the categories that you need to cover. You don't need to have terms for all of these things in your ontology. But if you don't have terms, for instance, for mental entity, which we don't have in BFO, or for religion, which we don't have in BFO, then we have to give at least an indication how, for instance, in some extension ontology of BFO, which already exists, like the mental functioning ontology, or in some other way, we have to show how BFO would deal with data about entities of that sort. So BFO exists as a textual artifact. That's the requirement for being a textual artifact. It exists as an OWL axiomatization using OWL 2. And actually, we provide 2 OWL formalizations, as you will see. And it exists as a common logic axiomatization. Moreover, the requirement in part 1 of the ISO standard is that we prove that the OWL is derivable from the common logic formalization. Common logic formalization is much more expressive because first order logic is much more expressive than OWL. First order logic allows relations of arbitrary parity. So you can have 2-place relations, as in OWL, but you can also have 7-place relations. And this means that the first order logic is not just more expressive, but also more intuitive for human beings. All right, and then common logic, it's ISO standard 24707, and as it says here, it's based on classical first order predicate logic. So OWL is just a fragment. And you can see how common logic or first order logic helps when doing ontology. So the infectious disease ontology has a term infectious organism, which is defined as an organism that has an infectious disposition. that can be expressed using OWL. OWL doesn't have any problem just stating that this class restriction holds. But if you want to define infectious disposition, you need a 5-place relation. And you can't do that in OWL. You just can't do it. And so the infectious disease ontology doesn't exist in a fully formalized version. It exists only in a fully articulated version in English, plus an OWL representation of a small slice of that fully articulated version. This is the definition of infection in the infectious disease ontology. This requires an 8-place relation. And now we have an opportunity to formalize it using BFO together with the first level logic axiomatization. All right, now I said there were 3 parts to the ISO standard. The second part is part 2, which is called Top-Level Ontologies / Basic Formal Ontology. Very soon we will reach the point where we can show people the standard, and we can already show people the formalization of the standard, which I will provide the link to in a minute. So once we've got past the voting hurdle, we will release a revised version of the BFO2 spec, which will make it conform to BFO ISO. You will see that this is not actually such a big deal. Then we will publish what we will call the BFO ISO spec for critical review. And you can start thinking about criticisms already now, because I'll give you the link to the most interesting parts of the content. And then if everyone is happy, we will replace BFO2 as the official version of BFO with BFO ISO. And we will create software. Actually, Gia is in the room. Gia will create software which will enable a semi-automatic update of existing BFO2-based ontologies into BFO ISO conformance. And this will not be a big deal, as you will see. Now, this is the part you can already see. The link is at the top. This is all the formal content of BFO ISO. First of all, there is a folder called OWL, which gives BFO ISO in various OWL syntaxes. 2 versions are provided. One version has a full set of temporalized relations, which I'll describe in a minute, and one has a minimal set of temporalized relations. The full set of temporalizations is the way we have of solving the OWL problem with certain kinds of time relations, which I will explain. Then there is a folder called model. And one of the requirements in part 1 is that the first order logic or common logic formalization of BFO of the ontology has to be proved consistent. Now, you can't prove formal logic axioms, axiomatizations as being consistent by machine. The reason we use OWL is because we can always prove consistency of a set of OWL axioms computationally, just by pressing a button. That's what the reasoners do. First order logic is not decidable. You can't prove consistency by using just a computer. You have to have a human being. Now, there are some automatic prover theorem systems which will enable you to do that proving job more quickly than if you were relying just on your pen and paper and your mind. But they are just secretaries. They don't do the proving for you. You have to build the models yourself. Now, Alan Ruttenberg will go down in history, I am sure, as the person who proved consistent first order logic axiomatization with more than 300 axioms. It's hard to do it with 5 axioms. Sometimes anyway. The people who built the software, the machine prover software systems, the software systems they created break after 100 axioms. Now, Alan Rottenberg created this model, which is available in various different formats. In Prover 9, common logic format and clause tested formats in the folder model at this link above. Then there is the common logic axiomatization itself in a folder called CL. And then there is a PDF folder which is all of the CL axioms, but expressed in traditional first-order logic syntax, which is the syntax which is easiest to read for human beings. This is BFO2. It is a hierarchy. You can't see it, or some of you may be able to see it. A lot of people are close to a screen. That is one advantage. This is BFO ISO. And these are the differences. So the first difference is we deprecate process profile from BFO. Now, that doesn't mean that those of you who like process profile, like me, can't use it anymore. We are going to put process profile in another ontology, probably the information artifact ontology, but we haven't decided yet. So you can still use it. It will sort of have exactly the same position in the hierarchy. It won't be part of BFO. And if people are interested, I can give you the reasoning for that decision. Then we have two new classes, namely temporal instant and temporal interval. And we have three classes which are renamed. So zero-dimensional fiat spatial boundary is renamed fiat point. One-dimensional fiat spatial boundary is relabeled fiat line, and two-dimensional fiat spatial boundary is renamed fiat surface. So that's 6 changes to the class hierarchy, which we think is actually quite modest. There are a certain number of additions to the relation side of BFO ISO as compared with BFO 2.0. Particularly as concerns time, as you will see. But since no one is using any of those relations, the existence of those relations will just be an added option for users in the future. It won't involve any changes in people's existing use of BFO, unless they want to change. It will be an option. This is what you get in BFO ISO. There is an improved set of definitions. There are many bug fixes. There are more good examples, more good formulations of natural language definitions, we believe. And then there are the formalizations, which I've just described. So, and then there is the very interesting fact, for some people anyway, that BFO will be an ISO standard, which means that high authorities in large organizations who have been skeptical about the sustainability or power of ontology technology will now be confronted with a really good argument for using BFO, namely that it's been vetted by the International Standards Organization. And I know already that that is having an effect. There are already people who know about this in high positions of authority who are starting projects in ontologies using BFO for this reason. This is the problem with OWL. So every portion of skin tissue has a K-site as part. Let's assume that that's true. Now, this would not capture that relation. So we have a portion of skin tissue which exists for this longer period of time, and then this has part K-site, some K-site, at a shorter period of time within that longer period. This does not capture the original thesis. Remember, the original thesis is every portion of skin tissue has a K-site as part. That means at every time when a portion of skin tissue exists, there is a K-site which is a part of that portion of skin tissue. So what about this? Why can't we say that what this means is that given any portion of skin tissue existing over a time interval, there is a portion of a K-site which exists over the same time interval, and which is such that it is part of that portion of skin tissue. The reason we can't say that is because it may not be the same K-site later in time as it was earlier in time. So the requirement that every portion of skin tissue has a K site as part is not necessarily satisfied by the same K site. Now this might seem like a very trivial problem, but it turns out that OWL cannot capture this kind of setup where we have a portion of skin tissue which has a part Y1 at time T1 and another portion of K site Y2 at time T2. This is permanently generically related. Skin tissue has part K site, but it doesn't necessarily always have the same part K site. OWL cannot handle that. And that is a problem because there are many cases where you want to say A is part of B. BFO was the ontology that was faced with this problem because BFO wanted to assert part of relations between, for instance, portions of skin and portions of K site. We wanted to assert that. We did assert it. We asserted it using OWL, and then we realized that we were saying something which is logically wrong. In other words, we were substituting generic relatedness with specific relatedness. That's what we did, and that doesn't work in every case. It works in many cases. So this particular problem doesn't happen very often, but it happens sometimes, and what that means is that in those occasions, your system will contain logically incorrect inference possibilities. And we wanted to work to solve that problem, and we have been working to solve that problem for some years. And now we have a solution. So in first order logic, it's very easy to formalize all of these three things because we can use three-place relations. In OWL, you can express the first two quite easily, but you can't express permanent generic relatedness using OWL. And the naive OWL along the first line is just ambiguous. You do not know whether you're dealing with permanent specific relatedness or permanent generic relatedness, or indeed temporary relatedness. So we created the BFO ISO axiomatization, and as I explained, it captures the terminological changes we just described. It removes certain details, bug fixes, normalizes the spatial temporal and spatio-temporal relations, and gives clearer definitions of relations like inheres in and S depends on. And now just a few words about the industrial ontologies foundry, which I mentioned earlier. So these are some examples of papers which have just appeared relatively recently. One is on a maintenance ontology using BFO. One is on how to use BFO in order to make domain ontologies built by engineers in different projects become interoperable by re-engineering them in terms of BFO. And then the final one is about physics-based simulations using BFO to create an ontology to support modeling, again within an engineering context. And there are a dozen or so papers like this, all of which appeared very recently. If you Google BFO-based engineering ontologies, you'll find a page where I listed all of these papers and provided links. And one other piece of news, which is, I think, relevant to many people in this room, there is something called the Allotrope Foundation, which was a foundation created by the world's large pharmaceutical companies in order to have a place where IT experiments could be carried out, where the common IT needs of the pharmaceutical industry could be addressed. And Allotrope has a system of ontologies, which is a BFO-based system of ontology.